Hi, I'm Jesper Sandell, and I'm a 3D designer. In this course, we'll animate and create seamless loops with abstract geometry in Cinema 4D. We'll create two very different looking shapes, but the setup for them is very similar. We'll be using procedural techniques that are very flexible and easy to work with. We'll start with a dark shape, and we'll go over how to build it with splines and something called a sweep object. And then we'll shape it and create its characteristics with deformers. And we'll then move on to animating it with a seamless loop. We'll frame the shot, apply 3-point lighting, and texture it. We'll also look at how to quickly preview our renders with the hardware renderer so we can work efficiently. Last step is to bring it into After Effects for some further enhancements. And then we'll take on the same shape again, and with just a few adjustments, we'll end up with a completely different result. Okay, let's start. Let's look at the sweep object. And we can find the sweep object under the generators menu. So let's add it to the scene. The sweep object creates geometry from splines. And as you can see, it doesn't do anything on its own. It needs at least two splines, one path spline, and then a profile spline that you sweep along the path. You can also add a third optional rail spline for some additional control over scaling and banking. So let's go ahead and add the first spline, and I'm going to use a helix. And the helix I'm going to use as my path spline. So I'm going to call this path. And in the helix, I am going to change the plane from XY to XZ. So it is going in a different direction. So the helix spline has lots of options, and I like to use this one for a lot of different things. We have a start angle and an end angle, which controls how spirally it gets. And I'm going to reduce this number to 400 so it's not too crazy. We have a start radius and an end radius. So let me reduce the end radius a little bit. And then the radial bias is controlling how thick or thin that curve is. Now, let me increase the height a little bit and zoom out. The height bias is going to control where the curve is, if it's close to the top or the bottom. So I'm going to leave it at this. Subdivision at 100 is good. In general, you want to have a lot of subdivisions when you're working with curved splines. So let's add the profile, and I'm going to use an end side. So I'm going to call the end side the profile. And when you add the profile spline to a sweep object, you want to make sure that you create it on the XY plane. So the end side, we can control the number of sides, 6. I'm going to leave it at 6. But we can see that if we're going to sweep this end side along this spline, this end side is way too big. So I'm going to reduce the radius to 20. And then I'm going to take the profile spline and I'm going to make it a child of the sweep object. And the order here is important. You want to make sure that the profile spline is the first child in the sweep object and the path is the second. So now we have geometry. You can also see that we have this weird issue here with the shading. And whenever you see it this way, it's almost always the result of the Phong tag. So if I go to the Phong tag here, we have a Phong angle set to 60. So it's trying to smooth certain areas and it leaves other areas sharp. And it looks like a mess. But it's easy to fix. So I'm going to reduce the Phong angle to 40 and that fixes it. So let's look at some of the settings of the sweep. We have in the Object tab, we have N scale, so we can have it grow over the length of the spline. We can also have it rotate. And then we have a start growth and an end growth. So say that I wanted to have it grow from 0 to 100, we could do it like this. And we also have under the Details tab, we have two splines, one for scale and one for rotation. So you can have very precise control over the scaling and the rotation over the spline here. So if I wanted to add some points, I could add my control or command key, add some extra
points on this spline. So you have a lot of control over this. So that looks pretty cool. The ends here, those are the caps, and they're all flat. So let's look at this one. Under the caps tab, we have start cap and an end cap. This is the end cap. Now, the settings, we can take away the cap so we don't have to have a cap. But the best option here, a lot of times, is the fillet cap. The fillet cap is going to allow you to have a cap, but also to enable some rounding on the edges, which tend to look much better. So right now, the radius here, which is the size of the edge, is too large. So if I reduce this to 0.5, we get a more reasonable edge. Now, the steps is going to control how many subdivisions you have. And the higher you go here, the smoother the edge is going to become. So if I set this up to, say, 6, it's starting to look really good. Now, if I set this back to a standard cap, you can see how flat it looks in comparison. And then when you enable fillet cap, it can capture highlights from lights and other sources. So it tends to look a lot better with a fillet cap. So whenever you have that option, I think you should use it in most cases. Now, in comparison now, this looks really flat because this one has this nice rounding, but now this looks kind of flat. So in the end side, we actually have an option for rounding there too. Now, when I enable this, it's going to be too big. The 17 here of centimeters is way too large. But if I match the 0.5 that we had on the edges, we're starting to get a much better looking shape. So we might as well put a fillet cap at the end here, which is actually the start cap. So if I go back to my sweep, I'm going to match up those settings. So step 6 and then the radius 0.5. So now we have a pretty nice looking shape. So that is an open spline. Let me put this under a null. I'm going to call this one open sweep. And let's put this sweep in that null and then hide it. It also works with closed splines. So let me add a flower to this. And this flower spline is going to work as my path. So I'm going to call this one path. And then along this path, I'm going to sweep a rectangle. And the rectangle is huge. So let's reduce the size to 20 by 20. And then we need a sweep object. Let's add that. And the rectangle here, that is the profile. And the profile needs to be the first child of the sweep, and then the path the second. And now we have this. And we can still manipulate the paths. So if I wanted to add a deformer to the flower path, by all means, go back and add our twist deformer, make it that a child of the flower path, and then fit that to the parent, and then we can start modifying the shape. So you have a lot of creative control. I'm also going to add the same rounding that I added in the last example here. So under the rectangle, we have a rounding for this one too. So if I enable this and reduce the size to the same size we had before, 0.5, then you can see how much better that looks, how much light it catches. It's going to catch reflections as well. So that is the introduction to the sweep object. Let me put this in a null. If I could hit it, there you go. Call this closed sweep. So that is the introduction to the sweep object. Now that we know a little bit more about it, let's go ahead and use it in our next project. In the next 2 lessons, we're going to create this. So in the first lesson, we're going to create the actual shape, and in the second lesson, we're going to make this animation. So this animates, and it is a perfect loop, so it's going to continuously loop. So let's see how we can do that. Let's go back to the starting file. And I'm going to use a sweep object. So I'm going to bring that in first. So sweep object. And the sweep object needs 2 splines. So let me use the flower spline. That's going to be my profile. So I'm going to rename this one profile. And I'm going to make a few changes to the profile. I am going to reduce the inner radius to 50 and the outer radius to 120. And then I'm going to add my path spline, which is going to be an end side. So let me call this one path. And I'm going to make it a little bigger, 280. And I'm not going to use 6 sides. So instead of a hexagon, I'm going to make that a triangle. And I want it to stand up. And I can make it stand up if I go to the coordinates tab and under rotation banking, if I do -90 there, now we have it standing up. So let's take the profile and drag it into the sweep as the first child, and then the path as the second, and then we have this, which in itself looks kind of cool. But I'm going to change a few things. I don't want to have 8 petals. I'm just going to use 3. So it's a simplified shape. And in the inside path, I'm going to enable this option, the rounding. And I'm going to increase this to the maximum. The maximum here is going to be 140. You can only go half of the radius value. So if this radius value was 300, we can increase the radius here to 150. But you can't go above half that value. So 280 is going to take it down to 140. Now both these splines need to have the intermediate points set to uniform. We're going to add displacement to this, so we need a lot of points on the splines. So let's set the first one to uniform 50, and let's set this one to uniform 50 as well. Now let's go to the sweep. I'm going to leave everything at its default for now in the sweep, except one thing. I'm going to change the end rotation. Now it looks bad. It looks really bad, and it's going to keep on looking bad until I hit exactly 360. Once you go to 360, you don't see the seam anymore. If you go above 360, you can see the seam. If you go below, you can see the seam. But as long as you keep it at 360, you have this perfect transition. And that is the shape. Now, you could play around with this a lot to create some completely different looks, or increase the number of petals. So I encourage you to play around with this, but I'm going to stick with the original values. So that's the shape. In the next lesson, let's animate this. Okay, so let's animate this. And the way we're going to do that is, let's go into the sweep. And under the Object tab and the Details section, we have the Rotation spline. If I move this spline up and down, you can see that the object rotates. And at the bottom of this spline, we have a value of -180 in the From field. And at the top, we have a value of 180. So, over the duration of the timeline, which is currently 90 frames, I'm going to keyframe this going from the bottom to the top. And whenever we keyframe in Cinema 4D, we need to work with the timeline. So I said that the duration of the timeline is 90 frames. We can see that the last frame here is 90, which is controlled with this field here. And the start frame is controlled with this field on the left side here. And the frames per second, or the speed of this animation, is 30 frames per second. So the entire loop is going to take 3 seconds to complete. And if you need to change the frames per seconds, you can go up to the Edit menu, and in the Project Settings, we have the FPS, the frames per second right here. So I'm happy with 30 frames per second, but if you need to change that for whatever reason, you have it right there. Now, if you wanted to have a slower speed on this, or if you wanted the rotation to take a little longer, what you could simply do is you can extend the timeline a little bit. So instead of 90 frames, we could double this to say 180 and then drag out this bar to match up. So now the animation would take 6 seconds instead because we have twice the amount of frames. I'm quite happy with 90 frames. So I'm going to reset that back to 90, but you can. So when we keyframe this, we want to look at time. We want to set a specific value at a specific time. And then Cinema 4D is going to interpolate between those keyframes. So at frame 0, I'm going to go back to my sweep. I'm going to take my rotation spline, drag it to the bottom, and set a keyframe. And to set a keyframe, I'm going to click on this button here. This is the keyframe button. And whenever you see these round buttons in Cinema 4D, that means that this property is animatable. So click on it, it turns red to indicate that we have a keyframe, and we can also see that we have this little rectangle under the playhead in the timeline as well. Now, if you made a mistake and keyframed the wrong frame, then you can simply take this keyframe and move it. But we want it at frame 0. And then let's go to the end. I can drag the time slider. I can also type it into this field, 90. And then go back to the sweep and take the rotation spline, drag it all the way to the top, and then click on this button again, make another keyframe, and now we have an animation. So let's play it. We have the timeline controls here, and if you hover over them, a tooltip is going to pop up. So this is go to start, this is go to the previous key, and this is go to the previous frame, and this is to play, and so on. So let's play this, and we have an animation. And you can see that the spline goes all the way to the top, goes to the bottom, top, and then back to the bottom again. Now, one thing you may notice is that the speed of animation isn't constant. It's slower at the beginning, and then a little faster in the middle, and then it slows down at the end. And that has to do with the keyframe interpolation. So let's take a look at that. If I go to the rotation property and I right-click on it, and in the menu here, we have animation. So we can add keyframes here, we can go to the next or previous keyframe. If you need to delete all keyframes on a property, you can delete the track here. That would remove all the keyframes. But what I'm after is the show F-curve. So here we have a visual representation of the animation. It's a little busy here, but there are only 2 properties that we're interested in. There are only 2 properties that are being animated, and that is rotation 1y and rotation 2y. The 1 and 2 are referring to the points on the rotation spline. So if I select this one and this one, so both the rotation ones, so we have them both selected at the same time, we can see the curve here. So let's play this. So you can see that this curve is corresponding to the speed of the animation. Now, if I want to make this a little bit more extreme, let's drag out these handles so we can see this a little bit clearer. Fast, slow, slow, fast, slow. So this is normally a good behavior in an animation. You don't want it to come to a full stop. You want it to kind of ease in. It gives a smoother animation, but not when you have a loop like this. So we're going to change the keyframe interpolation of the keyframes to, instead of this one, which is a spline, we're going to change it to this one, which is linear. So now that I click on it, we just have this spline here, and we have a constant speed. So let's close this window. We're done with it. Okay, so we're almost done. There's just one thing we need to do. If you pay close attention, when the playhead reaches frame 90, it kind of freezes. And it's because at frame 90 and frame 0, they have the same value. Because we've come to one full rotation. So we have 2 frames with the same value, and that causes this little freeze frame. But it's an easy fix to that. What we can do is tell Cinema 4D, don't go all the way to frame 90, go to frame 89, skip the last frame, and then go back to 0. So if I reduce this to 89, then Cinema 4D is going to ignore that last frame. We still have the same value for the keyframing on frame 90, but now the timeline goes from 0 to 89 and back to 0. So now we have a perfect loop. We have a constant speed, and we have no freeze frame. It's going to loop forever if we let it. So in the next lesson, let's add some more details to our shape. Okay, so we're going to add some more details to our shape now, the kind of details that we see here. And the way we're going to do that is, yes, we're going to use the Displace Deformer again. So let's start. Let's go back to the starting file here. And I want to add this entire sweep to a subdivision surface. So let's add a subdivision surface to this. If I hold down the Option key, it's going to make a parent of the subdivision surface. And I need to add a null too. So I'm going to add a null. And let's call this one GEO for geometry. And let's drag the subdivision surface into the folder, GEO folder. I can twirl it up. And let's add the displacer. So deformers, displacer, and make that the second child here. And in the displacer, what I'm going to do is I am going to set this to -10. And intensity, so it only pushes in one direction. It's going to push inwards in this case. And then shading, let's add a noise. And let's go into the noise. And I'm going to leave it at standard noise, but to get these lines that follow the flow of the polygons, we are going to choose UV. And the scale here, I'm going to reduce this down to 25. And then this one is going to be 0. So now we have the lines running along the polygons, but I'm going to take this one down as well to 50%. And I'm also going to increase the contrast to 100. So now we have these kind of sharp lines here. Now, let me twirl down the subdivision here and then go to the sweep and the Phong tag. Let's increase the Phong tag to the maximum 180. And that smooths it out a little bit. Let me go back to the displacer and into the noise. Now, occasionally, you're going to start seeing some artifacts with this. Not sure if I can see anything here. But if you start getting some artifacts and it just looks bad, there are a few things you can do. You can always increase the amount of geometry to start with. That almost always helps a little bit. So if we have the flower profile, for example, we can increase the number of intermediate points in the flower profile and the end side as well. You can also increase the geometry in the subdivision surface. And the viewport can really start slowing down if you add too much geometry. So what you can do is you can work with a lower setting in the subdivision editor and then have a higher value for the renderer, so it's not so slow while you're working. Now, in the displacer, you may also have to increase the scale sometimes. You just have to do tests with this, but sometimes you have to increase the scale a little bit. Or you can reduce the contrast. That helps a lot of times as well. Okay, so now this is too detailed, too many details. So let's add another noise on top of this and hide some. So let's drop this noise inside of a layer shader. Let's go into the layer shader and let's add another noise. And this noise we're going to use to cut off some of the bottom noise here. I'm going to hide some of that noise. So I'm going to set this blending mode to be multiply. And let's go into the noise and change the space from texture to UV. And let's take this down to 0. And I'm going to reduce this one down to 40, around 42, 40. Maybe 42 is better. And I'm going to increase the contrast of this one as well to 100. So now we are hiding a lot of that original detail. Now let me change to a seed value that better fits. I did tests and I liked seed 688. So that looks pretty good. Next up, let's add a camera and frame our shot. We're going to add a camera and frame the shot. But I did notice something, and it's that these details are just way too sharp. I want to have more variation in this. So I'm going to go back to my displacer and into the layer shader and to the bottom noise. And instead of having a contrast of 100%, I'm going to reduce it down to 60. This is going to give us a little bit more variation, and it looks a little better that way, I think. Okay, so now we have that. I also want to organize this a little bit better. So let's add a null and Command Control drag on this null to make a duplicate, and then do that one more time. And this is going to be the scene. This is the camera. And then this is going to be for the lights. So let's take the scene elements, drag them into the scene, and we're ready to add a camera. We should also set the output dimensions before we frame this. So let's go to the render settings, and under the output, I'm going to choose 1080 by 1080 this time. So it's a little smaller. But by having it a little smaller, it's going to reduce the render times quite dramatically. So let's close this. And let's add a camera. And let's go into the camera by clicking on this little icon. And when you add a camera, it is added at the exact same location as the editor cam. Now, what I want to do with this camera, I want to zero it out. I want to put it at world 0. I'm going to frame this a little differently this time. I'm going to use the camera more as a stationary camera and then rotate the shape around instead. So I want to reset the positions for the camera to its default, which is at world 0. Now I could do that by entering 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, or I could use the right click, which is going to reset the value to its default. But I want to show you a really useful command in Cinema 4D, and that's called reset PSR, which means reset position, scale, rotation to its default. In Cinema 4D release 20, that's under tools. This command right here, reset PSR. Now I'm going to undo Command or Control Z because I want to show you where it was in previous releases. It was under the character menu, character, commands, and it was in this menu right here. And if you can't find it for whatever reason, there's a really useful search function in Cinema 4D. And you get to it by using a shortcut. So Shift-C is going to bring up a search bar. And then we can search for anything in the application. But I'm going to search for reset PSR. And there it is. So we can run this command by simply double-clicking on this one. And now we've reset the camera to world 0 or its default. Now let's move the camera on the Z-axis here. Let's move it back a little bit. And I want this camera to have a flat view. I want to flatten the view out. And the way we do that is by changing the focal length. So we have a focal length of 36 millimeters, but I want to have a long lens. I'm going to choose the telephoto lens, the 135 millimeter lens. And now I need to move the camera further back because it's a long lens. I'm going to go further. And let me type in a value here, 2555. So that framing is done. We have the distance correct now for the camera. Let me move it into the camera folder. So now I'm going to take my scene, actually not my scene, I'm going to take my GEO, the null that contains all the scene elements, and let me rotate this one around. And while we do this, while I get the framing, I want to see it play. So if I play now, it's going to be a little sluggish because I have the subdivision surface enabled. But if I disable the subdivision surface, it's going to play a little faster. So I know a framing that looks pretty good is going to be 3 and then minus 48 and 45. I like this. So I think that looks pretty good. That is the framing. So we have the geometry set up. The framing is right. It's time to light the scene. That's coming up next. Let's light the scene. And we need reflections in the scene. So let's add a sky object. Sky. And then drop that into the lights folder. And I'm going to reuse the same HDRI that we've been using in the previous lessons. So let's go to the content browser, presets, and then prime, presets, light setups, HDRI, and then Sunny Park. And let's go back to the objects manager. I'm going to take the Sunny Park, drag it on top of our sky. And we don't want to see it. So right click on the sky and say Cinema 4D tags, compositing tag. And we don't want it to be seen by camera. So let's uncheck this. I also don't want to have any colored reflections. So let's go into the material. Let me drag that over. We don't need the reflectance, so let's turn that off. In the luminance, we need to take out the saturation, so let's add it into a filter. Go into the filter and then take the saturation down. So now we have black and white only. So we can close this. Now I'm using the same HDRI for all lessons here, and that's just to make it easier to demonstrate. The HDRI that you choose can have a really huge impact on the look. So you should try a lot of different ones until you get the look like you want. And there are also some third-party really great resources you can go to. And one that I would really recommend is hdrihaven.com. They have excellent free HDRIs that just look gorgeous. So hdrihaven.com. All right, so let's light this now. Let's add our first light. And I'm going to go here and I'm going to add a target light. And let's enable the 4 views here. So let's click on this one here. And I want to make sure that this window is active, and then I go up and start the interactive render region. Make it a little larger and up the quality just a little bit. And let's drag the light and the light target into the lights folder. And I don't want this to be a spotlight. I want this to be an area light. And I want shadows, so I'm going to set it to area shadows. And let me zoom out here a little bit in the top view. And I want to have this light sitting over here somewhere. So let me pull it in this direction. Something like that. And let me pull it up so it's coming a little bit from above. Maybe a little bit more towards the sides. I think that's good. Now I'm going to make this a slightly warm light. So let me add a little bit of orange to this. And let's increase the size. So the outer radius in the details tab, we can increase this to 200. And let's go back to the general tab. And I think it's strong. I want to create really soft lighting for this. So I'm going to reduce this right down to 50%. And then see what that looks like. I think that's good. I'm going to start with that. Let me call this one key light. Key light. And then let's duplicate that, which will be the fill light. Let me turn off the key light. Rename this one the fill. And I'm going to move the fill to this side, a little closer to the object. And I'm going to pull it down a little bit. And I don't want shadows on this one, so let me select none for the shadows. That's going to brighten it up considerably. Let me pull it up just a little bit. Maybe move it a little bit this way. Now I'm going to make this light really big. So in the Details tab, I'm going to increase this to 600. So it's going to be a fairly large light. And if I go back to the General tab again, I don't want this light to be yellow or orange. I want it to be a bluish color. Something like that. And I think that's good. Now I'm going to reduce the intensity to 30%. It says very, very dim. Maybe move it up just a sliver. Okay, so now let's look at the key light and the fill light together. So that looks good. So let me disable the key light. I'm going to duplicate the fill light. Command, Control, drag that up. And this is going to be the rim. Now the rim light, I'm going to put exactly on top of the shape. And let me turn off the fill. And I need to bring it up. And I'm going to change this light. So instead of a blue light, I'm going to make this a white light. I'm going to pull this a little bit to the side. So it's coming pretty much from straight above. Now, I don't want this light to have these characteristics. I'm going to go to the Details tab, and I'm going to set it to be a much smaller light. So 100 for the outer radius. I'm just going to change the character of that light quite a bit. So I think that is quite good. I might want to pull it down ever so slightly. Yeah, I think that's good. Let me go full frame on this. And then let's enable the fill and the key light. And that's good. That's the lighting that I want. So now that the lighting is done, let's texture this, and it's coming up next. Okay, so let's texture the shape now. With the interactive render region active, I want to switch the renderer. So let's go up to the render settings, and instead of the standard renderer, I'm going to set it to be the physical. It's just a little quicker to work that way. And in the physical settings, the sampler, I'm going to choose fixed. And then the sampling quality of low is good. It's going to give us a reasonably fast update. Let me close this. And let's create a material. Double click in the Materials Manager and bring the new material on top of the sweep. Let's open up the material by double clicking it. Let me bring this over so we can see it. And I'm going to disable the reflectance for now and focus on the color channel first. So I'm going to make this a dark gray with a slight bluish tint. The hue of 219 is good, but I'm going to have a saturation of 11. And let's bring down this to around 25. And I'm also going to switch the model from Lambertian to Oren-Nayar, which just gives a more dull surface, less plasticky. And let's enable the reflectance now. And we get our default specular. We don't want that, so let's delete it. And instead, let's add a GGX. So in the GGX, we have an attenuation of average. It's going to average the color of the color channel with a reflectance color. But I want to bring down this one and make it darker. So I'm going to have a similar color to the color channel, just a little bit more light blue. So 192 for the hue, and bring up the saturation to around 10. 9 is good. And make it darker. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, yeah, that's good. I want to add a Fresnel to this right away. So let's twirl down the Fresnel so we can get some reflection fall off. And let's do dielectric. And then the preset I'm going to choose is Emerald. Now the Fresnel is too overpowering, so let me bring back the reflections a little bit by reducing the strength to around 75. So I think that's good. I know that I don't want any specular strength at all, so I'm going to take that down to 0. But now we need some roughness on this. So let's bring this up just a little more. Okay, that's good. Let me take down the reflection strength ever so slightly to around 75 perhaps. Yeah, that's good. So the base material is done. Now we're going to add the golden stripes. I already prepared them for you, so let me show you how you can copy and paste a shader. We have gradient color texture here, and in the reflectance under the texture here, I have a layer set up. So let's copy this. I can click on this to get the drop down and then say copy shader. And let's go back into our material and then go to the texture slot and then get the drop down and say paste shader. And now we have that layer shader in our material. Now I want to change the mix mode instead of normal, which is now just using the layer here. Let's set this one to be add, so we get this color back. And let me show you how I built this. Let me take down all these to the first gradient. Now it takes a little while to build this, and I used the exact same technique that we did in the first project. So in the first gradient, which looks like this, let me go into it. We have a 2D gradient, and I just have 3 little golden lines here, and with no interpolation or step. And then if I go back up, we have a layer mask going in the other direction, which is just cutting off parts of it. And the effect is going to be that the colors are going to appear to be traveling along as this rotates and animates. And then I added another one on top, which just adds some more, and then a few more. And it takes a little while to build this up, so I spare you this time to having to watch me build it. But here we have it. And this is the material. Now I also want to add a little bit of surface imperfections. So we're going to add a bump. So let's enable the bump channel. And let's go into the texture and add a noise. And let's go into the noise. And of course, it's a lot too big here. So I'm going to reduce the global scale to 2. And because we're using a noise in the bump channel, we should also reduce the delta to match the global scale. That's going to give us a much better looking noise, or a much better looking bump. So let's reduce this to 2 as well to match up. And it's close, but I want to tame this. So let's jump up. And instead of the strength of 20, let's set this to just 5%. And that's the material. Let's close this window and enable the subdivision surface. And let's bring up the quality here to see what we've got. May take a while to update. Okay, so here we go. All right, the material is done. In the next lesson, I just want to show you how you can get a quick overview of the animation with the colors. And that's coming up next. I want to see what this is going to look like animated with these added colors. But to render out a full resolution render is going to take quite a while, so we need to find a different way to do this. Let me disable the interactive render region. It's always a good idea to output a low quality render, bring that into After Effects or whatever compositing program you use, add the effects that you want to get an approximation of the final output. We can also, inside of Cinema 4D, use the hardware OpenGL renderer. So let's go to the render settings. And instead of physical, I am going to select hardware OpenGL. Now your mileage may vary because this depends on your system and your graphics card. But if I go into the settings for the hardware OpenGL, we can enable something called Enhanced OpenGL. And that enables us to see shadows and reflections. So we don't need to save this. So let me uncheck this save. But under the output, we right now have a frame range of current frame, and I am on frame 77. So let's just render that one out and see what we get. So render to picture viewer, this one. And we're done. So by no means is this perfect, but it only took 3 seconds to render out, which is considerably faster than it's going to take for the final render. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this one to render out the whole animation. So let me close this window, go back into the render settings, and under the output, instead of current frame, the frame range, I'm going to say all frames. So from 0 to 89. And then I'm going to click render to picture viewer. There is no file name specified for the render image. Do you want to continue without saving? Yes, I do. So this is going to take a few minutes to render out, and I'll be back once it's done. The hardware render is done, and it didn't take more than 3-4 minutes to render out, so it's really quick. And now I can go ahead and play this. So we have the play controls here. So let me play this. And it plays pretty well. It's not perfect, but it plays pretty well here. And I can get a very good sense of what the animation is going to look like. And if I weren't happy with the colors, I could go in and change them or change anything that I wanted to change. Now I'm happy with this. I'm going to leave it at this, but it's good to know that we can get a preview so quickly. Okay, so I'm going to stop this, and I am now ready to output the final render. And that's coming up next. Okay, so let's render the animation. Let's go to the render settings. And let's start with output. We have 1080 by 1080. That is correct. Now we also have to look at this, the frame rate of 30 frames per second. That is correct. We are rendering all frames from 0 to 89. Also correct. Let's go to the save. Let's enable the save box and save it wherever you want on your hard drive. The format is going to be, as before, PNG. And instead of 8-bit, let's do 16 bits. And I'm just going to enable a standard alpha channel, a pre-multiplied alpha channel. And in the renderer, I am going to choose the physical. And I want to go to the anti-aliasing. And in the filter here, we have cubic, which is really good for a still image. It gives really crisp results. But for an animation, we could get some flickering with that. So let's choose this, the Gaussian, the animation instead. And then let's go to the physical settings. And the settings that I came up with after some testing is, or are, medium. I'm going to do fixed and then medium, but I'm going to increase the sampling subdivisions to 5. So with a still image, you can crank up the settings quite high. You're still not going to have to wait that long, but with animations, it could differ hours in render time. So you want to take your time optimizing the settings before you render. I mean, it's always going to be a push and pull between quality and render time, and I think testing is the key. And remember that some noise is acceptable in your animations, much more than with still images. Okay, so with that said, let's close this window and let's click on the Render to Picture viewer. And we're off. And this is going to take a while, so I'll be back once it's done. Okay, so the render is done. It took 3 hours to do, and here we are. Let's play this. And it looks good. I think we're done here. So let's bring this into After Effects and add some post-treatment to this. And that's coming up next. Okay, so here we are in After Effects, and we're going to create something similar to this. And let me play this so you can see that as well. Okay, so let's see how we can build our own. Let me go to the project window here. I'm going to bring in the footage. You can right-click and say Import File. You can also just simply double-click in this window. That's going to bring it in too. I'm going to do that. I'm going to select one of the images here and make sure you enable the PNG sequence so they come in as footage rather than as still images. And then click Open. And then I'm working with 32 bits per channel again. And if you want to toggle between the modes, you can use the Alt or Option. So 8, 16, and then 32. And I want to work in 32. And let's first fix one thing. Now, when we bring it in, I can see in the info box on the top here that it says trillions of colors and straight. This is referring to the alpha channel. And we didn't enable a straight alpha channel in Cinema 4D. So let's fix that first. I'm going to right-click on Shape 4 and select Interpret Footage, Main. And then I am going to select the Pre-Multiplied option. Leave black here, that's fine. And then just click OK. So let's take this now and drag it to the Create New Comp button. And that's going to create a comp with the correct dimensions. It's also going to create a comp with the right frames per second, 30 frames per second. And it's also, let me pull this one up, it also creates the correct duration. If I take my time slider and go all the way to the end, you can see that it matches up with 89 frames. Now, you may have seconds here. If you hold down the Control or Command key, you can click and switch between seeing this in time or frames. And I prefer to see it in frames. So we also have a transparent background here, so we can verify that this is indeed a movie with an alpha channel. If you want to toggle the transparency grid on or off, you can use this button. It's going to turn it on and off. We can leave it off. Now, because this is an animation, we can now play. We have a playhead, just like in Cinema 4D. If you want to play now, you can use the spacebar, or you can use the 0 key on the extended keyboard. Out of habit, I tend to use the 0 key. So when you hit the 0 key, it's going to load it into RAM, play it as fast as it can, and then it's going to play it back. And in the panel, the info panel here, we can always verify whether it's playing real time or not. So we can see FPS 30 and then real time. Now, your After Effects setup may not loop the way mine does. So let me show you how to fix that then. All these panels, if you don't see them for whatever reason, you can go up to the window and you can find all the panels here. But I'm going to go into the preview, and you can see that we have, right now it says spacebar, and this is referring to the settings here. I am changing the settings for my spacebar, and this button here, this is the one that says either play once or loop. This is play once, and this is loop. Now, if you also use the 0 on your extended keyboard, you want to have to change that by going to numpad 0 and switch this one as well. So that's a little gotcha that you have to change it in both places if you want to use both the spacebar and the 0 key. So now it's going to loop. Okay, so let's start adding effects. I'm going to go to frame 0, and I'm going to start by adding a background. So layer, new, solid. And I'm going to call this BG for background. And I'm going to make that the comp size. And I'm going to change the color to be black. And then click OK. And then OK. And then let's drag the background to the bottom here. I'm going to temporarily hide the footage because I want to add an effect to the background. I want to add a ramp to it. So let's go up to Effect. And then under the Generate menu, we have Gradient Ramp. Let me use my scroll wheel to zoom out. So this is a linear ramp, but I want it to be a radial ramp. So in the ramp shape, let's switch that to a radial ramp. And I want the beginning of the ramp to be right at the center. So I'm going to click on the start of ramp, use this little gizmo, and click right in the center. And the end of the ramp, I want to have around here. So I'm going to click end of ramp and then click down here. Now the colors are not right. I want black on the outside, and that's the end color. So what I can do is I can take the color picker and just sample this start color. And the start color, I want to have like a dark brown. So let's go into the colors. I'm going to bring a hue to around 30. That's good. And then fairly dark, something like that. And then click OK. Now, I want to make this more subtle, so I'm going to blend this with the original to say 75%. So it's so subtle now we can barely see it. But we're going to see this when we start adding glows to this. Okay, so let me zoom in here with the scroll wheel. And then let's add some effects here. I want to increase the contrast first. So go to Effect, and then Color Correction, Curves. And in the curves, I'm going to increase the contrast, but I want to pull this knot up here. Let me show you this is the controls the black value. And I don't want to crush the blacks too much. So I'm going to pull this one up just a little bit so it's not going to crush the blacks so much. And then I'm going to pull this one down to increase the contrast. And then increase the brights here a little bit more aggressively. I think something like that is good. Let's compare the before and after. Now, when you increase contrast, it also increases saturation. So let's pull some of that out. Let's go up to Effect, Color Correction, and then let's add Hue Saturation. And the master saturation, I'm just going to reduce that to -20. And then let me twirl this up. I'm also going to add a blur to this just to soften it up. So go to Effect, Blur, and Sharpen, and then add a Gaussian blur. And I'm just going to add 1 pixel blur. And I'm going to enable the Repeat Edge Pixels checkbox. So those are the effects that I'm going to make to the footage. And now I'm going to use adjustment layers. So let me go up to Layer, New, and I'm going to use a solid. I'm going to use this solid as an adjustment layer and keep reusing it. So I'm going to call this one Adjustment Layer. And this one is also going to be comp size. But I like to keep my adjustment layers white. It doesn't make a difference, but I like to keep them white, just to so I can distinguish between them and other layers in the timeline. And then click OK. So to make this an adjustment layer now, we need to enable this checkbox. This turns it into an adjustment layer, and now everything underneath it is going to be affected by whatever effects we add to it. And the first effect I'm going to add is the Stylize Glow, and this is what's going to define the look of this. So let's go into Stylize Glow, and I'm going to increase the radius a little bit. And then the threshold, which controls what parts of the image are going to be glowing. If I take this all the way down to 0, everything is going to receive the glow, and it looks very, very strange. So let's pull this up a little bit. Let's first adjust the radius to be around 140 or so, maybe a little less. And then the threshold, I want a little bit more affected. I'm going to take it down to around there. Let me put this down to say 0.9. So this is before and this is after. So it's really changing the look of this. But I want to kind of clamp the glows in a little bit. So I'm going to add one more curves to this. So color correction and then curves. And let me just increase the contrast to something like that. Now the curves adjustment, they're very sensitive, so just a little bit of a change there is going to dramatically change the look of it. So it's a little finicky. Let me put it around here. I think that's good. We can always come back and adjust this later. So without the curves here, you can see that it glows a little bit more, and this kind of brings it together. Let me, in fact, increase the contrast even more. Okay. Okay, I think that's good. Before, after. Okay, so now what I want to do is I'm going to add another adjustment layer. So let me go into the solids. When you create a solid, After Effects creates a solid folder for you, and in here we have the adjustment layer, so I can reuse this now. Let me pull this down, and then let's enable the switch for adjustment layer, and let's rename these. I'm hitting the return key, and I'm going to call the first adjustment layer ADJ, and then Glow Curves, and then the second one I'm going to call ADG, or J it is. I'm going to call this one Gamma Brightness. Because what we're going to do is that we're going to increase something called the gamma, which is really the midtones, which is going to make these colors a little bit more intense. So let's add color correction curves again to this. And in this curves, I'm going to clamp the bottom here. I'm going to put a point here and a point there just to clamp them. So I don't want to affect the whites and the blacks so much. Let me put this down a little bit. But I will increase the gamma or the midtones. And you can see that this has quite a dramatic effect. You can go overboard with this for sure. If you go the other way, it looks really strange. But when we pull it up something like this, it really starts bringing this to life. Compare before and after. It just intensifies everything. So I think that's good. Now I also want to increase the blue just a little bit. And let me pick a different frame. That's a pretty good frame, maybe here. So in Cinema 4D, we added a little bit of a blue tint to the gray, the dark gray material we had. But I want to accentuate that a little bit more. So let's add one more adjustment layer. And then enable the adjustment layer switch. I'll call this one ADJ. That's a K. ADJ. Boost the blues. And in here, I'm going to add effect, color correction, and then hue saturation. Now, in this hue saturation, I'm not going to work on the master. I'm going to select a specific color to work with. So in the drop down here, we have reds, yellows, greens, cyans, blues, and magentas. Now, let me illustrate that. If I, for example, choose the yellows, then we get a range of colors here. And this is the range going to red, and then this on this side we have greens. To see what the color range or the colors that are affected by this, you can take the yellow saturation and drag it all the way down to the bottom to see what is this range actually affecting. And we can see that it's affecting a lot of this. And if I pull these here, we can see that we've effectively taken out almost all the saturation. Now, if I bring this back to 0 again, then we can increase the saturation, or we could increase the lightness if we wanted to. But I'm not going to work on the yellows. I'm going to work on the blues. And in fact, in this case, I'm actually going to work on the cyans, not the blues. But I'm going to reset this effect. This is really nice in After Effects that all the effects have a reset button. So I'm going to click on reset. It's going to take it back to its default. And instead of the master, I'm going to work on the cyans. And I'm going to leave the range as is, but I'm going to increase the contrast. Now, if I go too far, it looks horrible. But if I take it up to, say, around 23, 22, it's going to be subtle. Before, after, I'm not sure if you can see that. It just adds a little bit of blue to it, and I think that's good. So I'm going to leave it at that. Now, on top of this, I'm going to add another effect. I'm going to add a tritone to bring all the colors together. And let me add another adjustment layer. I prefer to add the effects to several different adjustment layers. That way I can turn them on or off, but I can also tone them down by adjusting the opacity of the layer. So let me enable the switch, and then I'm going to call this one ADJ, and then tritone. And I'm going to use the tritone effect. So effect, color correction, and then tritone. And this is pretty far away from what we want, but let's see how we can fix this. So the highlights I want to leave alone. Now the midtones, I'm going to create this kind of orange. The hue of 32 is good, but I'm going to create like a little brighter around there. Let's click OK. And then the way I'm going to bring this together with the other colors in the composite is by using the blend with original. But before that, I want to add some blues to the shadows. So let me pick a blue around here, and then just a little bit around there. That's pretty good. And then click OK. So now let's blend this with the original. And I'm going to go all the way to 80. So this is before, and this is after. And in fact, I want to make this a little bit more subtle. So I'm going to reduce the opacity of this adjustment layer. So I'm going to twirl this down, and under transform, we have opacity. A quicker way to get this, because this twirling gets a little cumbersome, is to use the shortcut T. But since we're here, I'm going to use this one here. And instead of 100%, I'm going to lower the opacity of this to 75. And let's turn off the layer before and after. So it just brings things together a little bit better. Let's look at some different frames since this is an animation. So we're almost done, but I'm going to add one more thing, and I'm going to add some grain to this. So let's go back to the project, add one more adjustment layer, and then enable the adjustment layer switch. Call this one ADJ grain, and then effect, noise and grain, add grain. So we have this little preview here. In the viewing mode, I'm going to change that to the final output. And it is way too grainy here, of course. So I'm going to reduce the intensity to a tenth of this, so 0.1. And then the size, I'm going to make a lot smaller as well, 0.15. Now, it's probably subtle. I don't know if you can see it on the recording. You're going to be able to see it in your own After Effects project file. So if I turn it on and off, you can see that it looks better with grain. Now let me also find a frame so you can see why we added the background. See there, okay. So if I go to my background and just turn it off, then we would get black in the background. You can see that in the center here and on the glows, let me turn it back on so you can see. See, it just clamps it and just brings it together. It just looks a little bit better. This is without, and this is with. So that's why we added the background, to kind of bring all elements together. Let's go to the first frame, and here we go. We are finished. Let's play this, and then I'm going to hit the 0 on the extended keyboard. It's going to load this into RAM. Now, it's a little slower to play now because we've added a lot of effects. Up. I want it to keep loading. I want to go full screen after this. Almost done. Almost done. And here we go. Let me go full screen on this. And that's it. We have finished our project. Stop this. So to recap, we started in Cinema 4D and we used splines and the sweep object to create the geometry. And then we animated it and created a perfect loop. We added some details with a displacer, and then we added a camera and lights. The final steps in Cinema 4D were texturing and rendering the animation. And we also looked at the OpenGL hardware renderer to see how it can help with animation previews. And then here in After Effects, we've added some post effects to create this glowing shape that we have here as the final result. As always, thank you for watching. We finished color grading the project, but we didn't look at how we can export this out of After Effects. So let's look at that. Go to the Composition menu and select Add to Render Queue. And that's going to open up the Render Queue window at the bottom. And this workflow is very similar to exporting a still image, which we looked at before. But if I go down to the Render Settings and click on the word Best Settings, I want to make sure that the quality is set to best and that the resolution is set to full, and they are. And I also want to verify that the duration is 90 frames, so it all checks out, and click OK. And then let's go to the Output module and click on the word Lossless. And under the Format dropdown, I'm going to click on the dropdown here, and the options you see, they're going to depend on the system you have and the version of After Effects that you have. But as an example, I'm going to choose QuickTime. And I want to look at the format options for the QuickTime movie, so I'm going to click on this button. And under Video Codec, right now we have animation. I'm going to click on the drop-down. Now again, the options to see here depends on your system, but I would typically go for something like Apple ProRes 422HQ. Click on that and then select OK. And then we have channels and depth. I'm going to leave all this as is, We have an audio output set to auto, which checks for audio in your video. And if it doesn't find anything, it won't export any audio, which is perfect. So let's click OK. And then we specify where we want to save this file to and the file name. And then we click the render button. Now, I just wanted to use this as an example. I'm not actually going to render this out. But I want to go back to the output module. So on the word custom QuickTime, under the formats, if you have an older version of After Effects, you're going to have a lot more options here. Adobe has moved a lot of the export options in more recent releases of After Effects to its dedicated encoding application called Adobe Media Encoder, and including those formats, the web formats such as H.264. So we can still access them though, but we have to do it through Adobe Media Encoder. And as long as you have a Creative Cloud membership, you can download it. So I'm going to cancel out of this. So if you don't have it installed, install Adobe Media Encoder from your Creative Cloud application. And then let's move on. So I'm going to click on the Shape 4 here to bring back the composition. And then I'm going to go up to Composition. And then you can see that we have an option, Add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue. And that's going to open up Adobe Media Encoder, the application, and add it to its queue. So it's really easy to work this way. So let me click on it. And if you didn't have it open in the background, it's going to take a little longer. I cheated. I opened it up already. But you can see in the queue here that we have our composition, Shape 4. And we have a format set and a preset applied. Now, if I click on the format on the drop-down, we can see that we have a lot more options here. We have H.264, for example, which is enabled because I used that the last time, but we also have MPEG-2, we have PNGs, P2 movies, even animated GIFs. But I'm going to choose H.264 because it's a good format for quality and very reasonable file sizes. And then under presets, if you want to export to, say, YouTube, you have presets for YouTube or Vimeo or even Facebook. And if you click on the word H.264, you can see a little mini version of our composition here. And we have all the export settings on the right side. So we could choose the format and the presets from here. And we could change the output name if we want and the location. If I click on that. I'm not going to do that. It's going to be exported as an MP4. Export video and audio. We don't have any audio, so let's disable that. And then we have even more settings down here. So under video, for example, we have width and height. If I wanted to change that, I could just disable this checkbox and put in my own values here. I'm going to keep it as is. I'm not going to change any of these other settings either. But I will enable this one, use maximum render quality. Just scales it a little bit better. It takes a little bit longer to render, but this is going to be very snappy to render anyway. So click OK. And now we're ready to just send this out for render. And to do that, I'm going to click on this green arrow. And at the bottom, you see it's so quick. It's encoding, it's done. So let me open up the video. It's going to come on my other monitor. And I'm going to open that in QuickTime and bring this over. And in QuickTime, under the View menu, I can tell it to loop. And then let's play it. And there it is. Here is our exported looping movie. Let me stop that. So we finished our project and we exported our movie. Thank you for watching.
I originally planned on ending with this shape and this project, but I think it's good to add an extra example just to highlight the versatility of this technique. So we are going to build one more thing, and let me show you what that is. So we're going to build this, which is almost like a polar opposite. The first one was dark and contrasty, and this one is quite light. So if I play this back, it's a bit of a hiccup. It's looping seamlessly. It's just that the VLC player doesn't want to loop seamlessly, but this is a perfect loop. So we're going to create this. So it's almost a complete opposite of that dark shape. So let's see how we can build this. Let's hide this. So the beautiful thing about this is that we can reuse most of these elements. We just have to change a few settings. So first of all, let's clean this up a little bit. So we're starting with a bit of a clean slate. I'm going to hide the visibility of the lights by Alt or Option clicking on this. And then let's delete this material. We're going to create a new material, and let's also delete it from the materials manager so we don't get confused. And let's get out of this camera. So on this GEO, we do have some rotation changes here. We can set this back to its default by going up to Mesh, or Tools rather, and say Reset PSR. That's just going to reset it to its default. And let's hide or turn off the subdivision surface and the displacer for now. And then let's just focus on the shape. So I'm going to turn up the sweep now too, so we can see. So right now we have two shapes. We have the inside path, which almost looks like a circle, and then we have the flower profile. And I'm not even going to touch the inside path. I'm going to leave that as is, but I will make some changes to the flower profile. So in the Object tab, I'm going to reduce this inner radius to 13. And I'm going to keep this at 120. But I'm going to increase the pedals to 7. And then let's see what we get. If I re-enable the sweep, now we have a very different looking result. This kind of swirly shape, much thinner, much lighter. Now you could go even thinner or smaller with a radius here. So if I do, say, set this down to 2, then we have almost like these sheets. And this looks like a flower or something like that. Now bear in mind that we also have a displacer. So if I turn on the subdivision surface and the displacer, then this type of thin flower is not going to work very well with that displacement. So I'm going to set this back to 13. But I will lighten the displacement here a little bit. So let's go to the displacer. And under the height, right now we have -10. Let's reduce that to -3. So this is what we have now. Let me turn off the subdivision surface. Just do this a little quicker. So that looks quite good. So the next thing is to set up a camera angle for this. If we play this back, let's turn off the displacer. Let's play this back. So if I go to the old camera that we had and look, it's quite flat. And the reason for that, if we go into the Object tab of that camera, we have a focal length of 135 millimeters. And that's a fairly long lens. And the characteristics of a long lens is that it's going to flatten the things that you zoom in on out. So this is a much flatter look. So what I want is the opposite of that. I want to emphasize extreme angles. I want to create some distortions in this. And a very good way to do that is to change the focal length. I'm going to go right down to super wide. And it jumps off to the horizon. But let's zoom in. And let's just rotate the camera around a little bit. So now you can see what a difference. See how you get all these distorted angles? Now that you just rotate the camera even the slightest. And this is perfect for the loop. It's going to have the appearance of these kind of these parts of the flower rotating around. It just increases the distortions, and it looks quite nice that way. So I want to have it at a slight angle, perhaps something like this. Let's play this and see what we get. We can adjust this. So depending on how much you want to emphasize the distortions, you can angle the camera more or less. I think I'm going to have it, I think something like that looks quite good. So let's pause this and let's go into Options, Configure, and under the View tab, let's increase the opacity of the tinted border to 95, just so we can frame this a little bit better. And I think actually that framing is going to work quite well. So I'm happy with that camera, so I'm going to lock it. So right click on the camera, Cinema 4D tags, and then let's do a protection tag. And let's enable the subdivision surface and then the displacer to see. So this is what we have. So in the next movie, actually, you know what? Let me change this up a little bit. Let me go make sure. Maybe something more like this. Once you turn on displacement, sometimes you have to make adjustments. So I think maybe I like this a little bit better. Let me turn off the displacement and the subdivision surface to play this back. Yeah, I think this is a little bit better. Okay, so now, after I changed my mind, let's lock that one again. Protection. And turn on the subdivision surface and the displacer. And this is the end of the lesson. In the next lesson, let's go ahead and light this. So that's coming up next. Okay, so let's go ahead and light this. And I want to add a bright backdrop to this. So let's temporarily hide our shape. Option or Alt clicking on the stoplight. And then I'm going to add a background object. I'm going to pull that into the scene. And in the background object, I also want to create a material. So I'm going to double click in the materials manager. And I'm going to call this BG. And then let's put that on the background. And to see this, we need to enable the interactive render region. There are a few things I want to do to make this quicker. The first thing is I want to turn off the displacer. And I want to turn off the subdivision surface. And then I also want to go into the render settings. And the physical render is what I want to use. So under the physical tab, the options, the sampling quality, let's set this right down to low. And in fact, I'm going to go even lower, just so it's quick while we preview our lighting. So let's set all these to 1 and close this. Now let's enable the interactive render region. Interactive render region. And I'm going to pull it out so it matches our render size. Something like that. That's good. So now let's go into the background material. I'm going to double click it and then pull it over here. And we don't need reflectance. In the color, we're going to add a gradient. So let's click on this drop down and say gradient. And then let's go into the gradient. And what I want to have is, instead of a 2D U, I want 2D circular. And I want the darker areas to be on the outside, so I want the reverse of this. So if I right click under this bar, I can say invert gradient. And I don't want it to be white. Let's twirl this down. I don't want it to be white. I want it to be very bright, but not quite white. So that's probably pretty good. And now this one I want to make a lot brighter. So something like that. I don't have a specific number in mind. I just want to create a light gradient or a light background. I think that's going to do it. So let's close this. And let's re-enable our shape. And let's see how we can light this. So we have to go, we already have the lights set up. So if I twirl this down, and right now they're all disabled, so I can enable them. And I want to work on one light at a time. It's a much better way to work. You get a good idea what each light is doing. So I think that's good. Now let's click away from the background so we don't have anything selected. Let's look at this in all 4 views. So you can either hit F5 or click on this button. And okay, so the key light is what I want to start with first. And my thought process here is that I want this to be light and airy. And that means I want to also create low contrast. So this first key light, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the size. So if I go to the Details tab, right now we have an outer radius of 200 centimeters, but I'm going to increase this to 600 centimeters. Bigger lights are generally softer, creates less shadows, less harsh shadows. And that's exactly what I'm going for. And also, what I want to do, you can see how close the camera is to the actual shape because it's a wide angle. I'm going to put this light almost directly behind the camera. So we can see in all 4 views here what's going on. So on the top, we also see here, I want to pull this one up in the right view. I'm going to pull this up. Maybe pull this back a little bit so it's not as close. And just put a hint of an angle on there. So I think that's a good start. Now, I also want to make sure that this light isn't too yellow. If I go back to the key light and the general tab, and we have a yellow saturation on this. So let's just take this down a little bit. So we have a little bit of yellow in there, which is nice, but not too much. So that looks pretty good. We don't have a lot of shadows inside of the shape, which is exactly what I want. So now let's set up the fill light. So let's enable the fill light. And the fill light, I'm going to have actually somewhere around here. That's pretty good. Now this is too blue, so let's reduce the saturation of that to say 7. And then this is already a big light. This is a 600 centimeter light, which is good, which is what I want. But let's see. I just want to fill in a little bit of the information and create a little bit of contrast. I think if I pull this down a little bit. So let's see what that looks like with the key light. Okay, so let me do one more change here to the key light. I think perhaps let's increase the intensity of the key light so it's a little brighter. And then what about the fill light? Yeah, let's increase this to say 60. And then let's look at these both at the same time. So I like that. That's good. Let's move on to the rim light. Let's enable that. So the rim light I want to have behind. Now, because this is a hollow shape, we're going to get some light coming through the crevices, which is good. I just want to create some additional highlights here. So let's take the rim light. Let's see, how big is this? This is 100 centimeters. I don't want this so contrasty, so let's bring this up to say 400. And let's pull this back. I want this on the other side of the camera. So let's zoom out in the right view here. So actually, not bad. See that we're getting some interesting highlights here. See if I pull this to the side a little bit, see what we get. Try the other side. I kind of like this one better. Let's see. What is the intensity? We can perhaps bring up the intensity a little bit. Say 60. Yeah, I think that's good. Let's see all lights at the same time. So I think I like this lighting. Let's leave it at this. If I bring this perspective full screen back, we can see what we have. Now, to appreciate the lighting, if I turn off all these lights, we're going to get the default light. So this is what we have at default, this kind of harsh lighting. So by lighting it, we get more tonal changes. It's a softer paint of this subject or this object, which is exactly what we want. So I think this is pretty good. Let's leave the lighting like this. And let's move on to texturing this. And that's coming up next. Okay, so let's go ahead and texture this. First, let's create a new material. Double click in the materials manager, and I'm going to call this shape matte for material. And let's drag that on the sweep. And then let's go into the material, double click it. And then here we go. And let's focus on the reflectance. We're going to come back to the color later. But in the reflectance, let's change some things here. First of all, it comes with a default specular. We don't want that. So let's delete that. And instead, let's add a Beckman. And it becomes this really shiny shape now. The attenuation is how the other channels are combined with this. So right now it's set to average, but if I change this to additive, that means the color channel is going to be brought in as well. So now we have a much brighter kind of shape. Now I'm going to increase the roughness just a little bit, 16%. So it's a little rougher. And then I'm going to bring down the reflection strength to around 75. So now it's less reflective. But I also want to bring in some fall off on the edges for the reflection, and that's the Fresnel. So if I look at the layer Fresnel and twirl that down, and then what type of Fresnel do we want? You either want a conductor, which is a metallic type of Fresnel, or dielectric, which is everything else. And I know that I want to use the PET preset. So that's good, but I want to bring back some more reflections. I'm not going for a realistic look here, so we can play around with this as much as we want. So say 57. So we just bring back some of those reflections, and I like that better. Now, one more thing that we can do before we add the color is that we can add just a little bit more of shadowing. And one way we can do that, we can always play with the lights, but we can bring in something called ambient occlusion, and that's under the render settings. So if I go to the render settings, and it's under effect, and then ambient occlusion, and that just adds darkening in the cracks and the crevices of objects. And you can see that it got a lot darker. And this is too dark. I don't want to emphasize those too much. I just want to have a subtle effect. So I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm not going to have black. I'm going to take this black knot and just bring it up into around here in the grays. And then I'm also going to change how this gradient is mapped. I'm going to take the bright areas, I'm going to pull it right in so that we get more bright areas back. And I think that's going to be pretty good. So if I turn the ambient occlusion off, you can see especially here in these crevices, and then I turn it back on. See, it looks better. Now we have very low render settings, so it's very noisy, but once we increase the render settings, this is going to look a lot better. So that's good. Let's leave it at that. So now let's add the colors. I already prepared the colors because this is a fairly slow process to do, but I'm going to show you how I set them up. So let me go to this material, colors, and let's copy, go into the color, and then we can copy the shader. So if I say copy shader, and then I'm going to double click our material, I can go into the same drop down and say paste shader, and now we have the colors in there. And this is placed inside of a layer shader, so let me go into the layer shader and then into the gradient. So I have this gradient set up. It's the direction is 2DU, and what I've done is I've created lots of little knots with colors, and I have painstakingly gone through and tried to make it look as good as I possibly could. I wanted to make sure that a lot of these colors are on the edges of this. So the process is really to move these little knots around until you get something that you like. So see that we lost this color here now, so I can move that back. So now I have it back. So you could use this gradient, but it's a much better idea to create your own gradient. It's a much better way to learn, and just place the gradients where you see fit, where what looks good. What I like about this is that we have lots of the colors on the edges, which is going to make it look good when this one travels around. I also like the fact that we do have some soft transitions and then also some harsher transitions. So it just builds to the complexity of the object. So that's what I liked, and that's why I set up the gradient the way I did. And if I right-click here, in Release 20, you can select the interpolation of all knots at once, and this one is set to cubic. And cubic gives you a very kind of smooth interpolation. So they're all cubic. So that's the setup. Let's go and see how we can render this. So let's close this material. And then let's go to the render settings. And let's look at the settings for the renderer first. So I did some testing, and fixed was the fastest to render, and I used medium. In fact, I used 5. I increased the subdivisions here to 5, but I'm going to keep it 4 for now because just it's a little faster to render. But I think in the other example I showed you, I used 5. But I want to bring these back to 222, which is their default. So this is going to give you a good render quality. There will be a little bit of noise in there, but since this is a moving object, we're not going to really see that too much. And let me enable the subdivision surface in the back and then the displacer. That's going to make it a lot slower to render. So as we set up the render settings, it's going to think about it. So in the output, I have a width and a height of 1080 by 1080. And then the frame rate is still 30. I haven't changed any of these things from the other shape. And then we go to 89, which is what creates the perfect loop. It goes from 0 to 89 instead of 90, which creates the perfect loop. And then in the save options, pick a file name. I think I did this one. I can just save it here. Actually, let me create a folder for it. Folder. This is loop swirl. Okay, so let me save it in there. Loop swirl. Swirl. And click save. And the format, I'm going to do a PNG, and I'm going to do 16 bits per channel. But we do have a backdrop, so we don't need an alpha channel. So let's disable that. And yeah, I think those settings are good. So now what I'm going to do is disable the interactive render region. And I'm going to shoot this off for render. So I'm going to click this button here. And now it's going to start ticking. And I will pause this and I'll be back once it's rendered. Okay, so the render is finished, and on my machine it took close to 2 hours, around 1 minute and 18, 19 seconds per frame. So your mileage may vary, depends on your machine here. But let's dress this up just a little bit in After Effects, and that's up next. Okay, so we are in After Effects, and I have imported the footage. Let's make a composition out of this. So I'm going to take this, drag it to the Create New Comp button, which is going to create a comp with the correct dimensions and the correct frame rate. And then I'm going to pull this into the comps folder that I created. And let me zoom out so we can see the entire thing. So if we play this back, we get this. And it loops perfectly, which is what we wanted. Now, let's just add a little bit of color correction to this. I want to overall make it a little bit brighter, a little lighter. And I also want to add just a little bit of blur to this. So go to, actually we have to be in this window first. Layer, new. I'm going to do a solid, and I'm going to call this solid ADJ for adjustment. White's good. Make comp size, and then OK. And well, it's a solid now. To turn this into an adjustment layer, we click on this switch here. Okay, so let's start by adding effect, color correction, and then curves. And in this curves, I'm just going to brighten this up. Let me start up here. Pull this up, something like that. Maybe pull this down for a little bit of additional contrast. Just something like that. Before, after. Before, after. So this is really all to taste. But I think this type of animation could benefit from being a little bit lighter, brighter. I'm also going to add a blur, effect, color correction, and that's not right, blur and sharpen, and then just a Gaussian blur. Repeat the edge pixels, and maybe just 1 pixel. Okay, so without these effects, we had this, and now we have this. So on top of this, I want to add some more blur. So I'm going to duplicate this adjustment layer. So Control D or Command D. And then the top one I'm going to call ADJ brightness. And the bottom one I'm going to call ADJ motion blur. And for now, let's turn off the top one, and let's delete the Gaussian blur and the curves. So I want to add a little bit of motion blur to this, and there are a few different ways you can do this. If you have a third-party plugin, the Real Smart Motion Blur, this is a good option. If you don't have that one, we can always use time and then pixel motion blur, which is a pretty good effect. And you can see that it got blurry here. Let me increase the shutter samples to say, I don't know, 12. And then let's just play this back. It's going to have to chug along just a little bit. So the shutter angle here basically controls how much blur you get. If you set this to a higher value, you get more blur. And the shutter samples is the quality of the blur. So here we have it. And then if I turn it off, you can see that it just looks a little bit less fluid. So I prefer it on. Now let's enable those other effects as well. Needs to chug along a little bit, but let's wait for this to load into RAM. There you go. Okay. And let's see if we can zoom in here. Probably not. Yeah, that needs to reload that into RAM. But so this is the final result. You can always tweak this any way you want. So this project is actually finished. I do want to show you one more thing though. If we go back to the projects folder, I have one more. So this is just an additional thing that you can do with this looping technique in Cinema 4D. The exact same setup, except I just tweaked a few parameters, and then I made this. So we're not going to work on this project, but I'll add it as an extra project that you can tinker and play around with. So the same setup. Now this has a fairly complex layer shader setup inside of Cinema 4D. This is really the fourth course on abstract shapes. So in the first course, I go into depth on how to create these kind of intricate, complex layer shaders setup. So if you're interested to see how to set that up, check out the first course. But that concludes this project. I hope that you found techniques that you can use in your own projects. Thank you for watching the course. This was the final in a series of 4 on making abstract shapes in Cinema 4D. So if you didn't see the other ones, I recommend checking them out. Play with these techniques and have fun. There are so many different ways you can go with this. And remember to post your projects. The habit of publishing your work does wonders for your improvement. Even if you didn't reach the level of perfection you were hoping for, perfection is an illusion. The work is what counts. Let me know if you have any questions or perhaps ideas for what you'd like to learn. You can reach me on velocitypeak.com, where I post projects and tutorials, and I'm also on Twitter at Jesper Sandell. I hope you found the course helpful, and if you did, don't forget to leave a review. If you follow me here on Skillshare, you'll be notified whenever I publish a new course. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.